This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast number 84, Politics, Part 2. I am Hal Hammons, and I am a citizen of heaven, and your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. Thanks for coming back this week. This is the second half of my conversation with Clevenger and Reagan McClenny. Please check out the first part if you have not done so already. We covered the topic of tolerance in the first part. Here we turn to the war climate in our country that is quickly and perhaps inevitably coming to a boil, much like it did a century and a half ago. We will also discuss the downside to a win-at-all-costs mentality, whether it is in board games or in life. This is what I've been reading.
I've been reading J.D. Tant, Texas Preacher, as anyone who's listened to the podcast for the last month knows. Tant was born in the Reconstruction era South. For close to half a century, the nation had been sharply divided between absolute moralists in the North, who required Southerners to abide by their standards, and absolute libertarians in the South, who insisted their own affairs were none of anybody else's business. In hindsight, I think it's fair to say war was inevitable, and I fear it is inevitable today. In fact, I think the war has already begun. What can a Christian do in a world that's on fire?
Well, we shine our lights. If the world is on fire, maybe use the analogy of darkness, right? The darker the world gets, the brighter light can shine. And that's what we're called to do. And in the midst of all this division where the world is on fire and so forth, we need to show people a better way. I mean, that's what Jesus said he was going to do. That's what we need to be doing, right? I'll show you a better way than all of this. Love was the better way that Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians. And certainly we need to do that with others. And a world that's on fire, a world that's filled with darkness, a world of division provides an opportunity for us. You know, 1 Corinthians 11, and talking about the Lord's Supper, there's an interesting verse there that Paul throws in that we kind of skip over a lot of times. He says, "For there must also be factions among you." He talks about the division that they have. He says there must be division. There needs be division among you, I think the King James says, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. So division is not the goal, that we don't want that, but it does serve a purpose. It serves the purpose of showing those who are really doing what they ought to be doing. It's like Matthew chapter 18, for offenses must come, but woe to the one who brings those offenses, right? So we don't need to be the ones who are spreading division. We don't need to be the ones who are setting the world on fire. But if that's the case, it does provide us with an opportunity to show people that there's something better out there, and most people are going to be searching for that. I mean, why are so many people caught up in all of these causes? Because I think God put in us a desire for something more, for something greater. People are searching for, what is my life supposed to be about? And for a lot of them, it becomes, social justice in different ways. Well, what if we can show them, no, there's something better that your life can be about? I pray that all of these things might turn out to the furtherance of the gospel, that we have an opportunity to be different, and that difference is clearly seen because culture is getting further and further and further away from the truth.
Earlier, we talked about the cultural influence of our country on the church, and one segment of that was after the Civil War, most members of the church became very strongly anti-war and believed that Christians should not be in the military. Now, I'm not going to advocate that or take a position on that, but I think it's interesting and insightful that after having gone through that kind of a civil division or civil war of such magnitude in the country, so many Christians looked at that and said, I'm just going to pull away from that completely. And if you consider 2 Corinthians 10 verse 4, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God in tearing down of strongholds. If my focus is on trying to save the lost, trying to get other people to heaven, and I look at this brewing war, whether it's riots in the streets or, take your pick, and I think you can kind of understand why those post-Civil War Christians said, you know what, we're not about this. We're just going to pull away and focus on what we do. And I'm not going to say that a Christian can't be in the military. That's not what I'm saying. But I think at some point we have to realize that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. This is not our fight. By taking up arms and fighting our fellow citizens, how is that going to advance the kingdom of God?
I think that's the question that we pose, and I think it's the right question. The question naturally is, when we're living in a carnal world, which side are you going to be on? Which side is godly? Which side is righteous? Which side is more heaven bound? Which side has, it's the battle hymn of the Republic aspect of warfare, right? We are fighting God's war by abolishing slavery or whatever.
Which both sides in the Civil War took the position that they were on God's side. Even in Nazi Germany, there are belts that have in German, "God is with us." And of course, there's a lot of cultural things that were involved with that. But I think that's generally the case. Like, we think God is on our side, which is totally framing it the wrong way. I want to be on God's side, right? What side is God on? I want to be on his side, whatever that is.
And that's a difficult thing for us to do, right? It's difficult for us to separate ourselves from the carnal aspects and sit on the sidelines, like Ty was saying, basically, and say, this is not my conflict. Well, it's your conflict whether you want to or not, to a certain degree, right? I mean, you're living in the world. This is the way it is. If your neighborhood is on fire, you can be opposed to the one side or opposed to the other side, but your neighborhood's still on fire. That's the world you're living in. To a certain degree, I think we have to maintain some distance. And we stand against error on both sides, obviously. But this can't become our fight. We already have a fight, right? We already have a war that we're engaged in. We're busy fighting in that war. And going back to what we were talking about before, as far as differing aspects of the church, if I tend to side with this party over here and my brother tends to side with this party over here, but Jesus is most important in both of our lives, we have to find a way to be together in the important fight while we may disagree and even battle to a certain degree. The Christian warfare always has to be the most important thing in our lives.
You triggered something, a memory of what we talked about in an earlier segment about Paul invoking his status as a Pharisee. That was clearly a party within the Jewish society. And that was a fiercely contested battle between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But what Paul did not do was insert himself to that battle with the Pharisees. And Jesus, I think it's in Matthew 23, where he talks about the Pharisees have set themselves in the seat of Moses. And Jesus is basically saying they're pretty much right on these biblical issues. Yet who did he spend most of his time criticizing? Was it the Sadducees? No, it was the Pharisees. And so I think an analogy I could draw, because I grew up in East Texas, pretty conservative upbringing. I think most Christians, certainly in the South, tend to be pretty conservative. And I would agree with most of them that a certain party on certain moral issues is probably closer to God's will, but I would be very, very cautious. And I'll say I even belong to that particular party, and I am a registered member of that party. But following the example of Paul, that doesn't mean I devote my life to that and say, we're the good guys and you guys are the bad guys, and I'm going to spend my life trying to defeat you. It's a distance I think we were talking about earlier. That yes, I do think this group is more right on these issues. And I understand that Christians may have the opposite view of me on that, but ultimately, Jesus did not spend his time trying to resolve Sadducee versus Pharisee. He spent his time saying, this is the objective standard of truth, and this is what we have to follow, and everything else is secondary.
I will say this. This is a guideline that I've placed on myself here, something that I try to keep my eye on in these conflicts, these difficult times. Most of the prayers that I hear from brethren online or even in person is that we get a certain outcome, that the carnal war go in a certain way. And I'm not opposed to those kind of prayers, because government can do a lot of good as far as helping us live lives here on earth. But I have found it helpful for me to spend the bulk of my time in prayer praying that my attitude and that the attitude of my brethren draw closer to God in these situations, regardless of the outcome. Because I think that's really the central issue here. It's not about whether we can get abortion outlawed or whether we can get immigration lightened up or whether we can, whatever your hot button happens to be. it would be so much better for Christians if X happened, if this guy were elected, if this guy were not elected. We have been so sheltered, I think, in the United States of America for the last whatever. It's been so easy for us to be Christians here, separated from any kind of serious official persecution, that we have come to believe this is our birthright. And that persecution, that opposition, especially opposition from powers on high, is somehow weird or an aberration or a blip on the screen that has to be eliminated immediately. Historically speaking, that is the absolute opposite of what the history of the church has been. And the answer in the first century and the answer in subsequent centuries and the answer today, I think, is not arranging things so as to not have as much problems here on this earth, so as to not have as many barriers between us and a free course of action, but rather that we have the kind of attitude, the kind of commitment that we need to deal with the situations that we have. And unfortunately for us in the short term, that kind of growth, that kind of development, personal development, usually happens in difficult times,
Yes,
rather than in positive times. It very well may be that we are being pruned by God at this point. I have an analogy that I sometimes use with regard to crepe myrtles. And those of you who are listening, and you're from Texas or from the South, you know about crepe myrtles. This beautiful, beautiful tree, or whatever you want to call it, that gets all bushy, and autumn comes eventually, and winter, and it all dies back, and it's just ugly, ugly, ugly. And then one day, sometime in mid-January, you wake up and you get in the car and you go to Walmart on a Saturday morning or something like that, and it looks like there has been a ritual killing. Every crepe myrtle is just whacked right at the top. It seems like they all happen at the same time. They all coordinate. And it looks so much worse than it did the week before. But after they cut it back, it comes back. It grows. These people know what they're doing. It becomes much more vibrant and flourishing. And this horrible short-term approach has a long-term effect. I think that is what has happened in the Lord's church historically, that we have gone through these prunings, these ritual fires that have been horrible in the short term. But afterward, the church is smaller, the church is stronger, the church is more energized. And the long-term result is that God is glorified even more, because you don't enjoy the pruning by any means. You don't enjoy going through the smelter fire. But at the end of it, we're better off than we were before.
you reminded me of a conversation I had years ago with a Jewish friend, and she's not particularly religious either, but she made the point that Jewish identity and Jewish culture thrives under persecution, and that in the United States, it tends to dissipate because they are generally accepted here. There's generally not persecution, so they start intermarrying and they start losing their identity. I mean, that analogy goes back to the Old Testament and the Israelites, marrying in with surrounding cultures. And the church is no different. When it's kind of accepted and respected socially to be a Christian, it just gets easy, and you can kind of hedge your bets and have one foot in the world and one foot in the church, or at least think you do. And it weakens the church side. Back to your point, absolutely, or actually back to Reagan's point, absolutely, God uses these sort of things to strengthen the church, and persecution serves a role. And I think it's important to remember that we're commanded to pray for those in authority. We're also commanded to pray for our enemies. And I find myself more and more just praying for wisdom about what to pray for, and praying, Lord, thy will be done. Because God may be raising a Nebuchadnezzar against us. I want to be careful here, but maybe that candidate that you hate so much, maybe that's God's Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, you don't know that. Individually, I'm going to do what I can to advance what I believe is right in a societal way, certainly, so long as it's not going to interfere with my duties and responsibilities as a Christian. But in order to do that, I've got to be respectful. Romans 13, I mentioned earlier about those who are in authority. And if I am railing against this candidate because I hate that person, that's not how the church grows. That's how the church becomes, going back to your point, that's how the church becomes more worldly. When I start trying to mix politics into the church, we start to assimilate into the world.
Sunday, I'm going to be preaching on what we should be praying for. And that's one of those things. There's lots of things that we could be praying for and might be appropriate to pray for, but we're commanded, we have lots of rights, but this is a responsibility. This is what we're supposed to pray for. 1 Timothy chapter 2. Therefore, I exert first of all, this is important, right? That supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. So who are we praying for? We're praying for all men, but specifically we're praying for those who are in authority, for kings. And who was the king of Rome when Paul wrote this? It was Nero. As bad as all the presidents, some presidents have been, we don't have anything to compare that to, at least not in this country, right? And so he says, pray for them. And then he's specific about what you need to be praying for. You need to be giving thanks. He says there's always something to be thankful for, even with evil, sinful, worldly leaders. And let's not be too dramatic. I think sometimes we're really dramatic on these things. In our life, in my life, we have unprecedented freedom to worship and to practice Christianity as God commands in this country. We have unparalleled access to God's word without censorship or having to go, secretly talk about God's word. We have incredible protections on our freedoms to preach the gospel message without government persecution. And maybe some of those things are changing, and maybe in our generation they will. Maybe some places that's the way the wind's blowing. But the reality is, right now, that's not the case. And I should be grateful for lots of things in this country. I should be giving thanks. And then I'm praying that we might be able to live a quiet and peaceable life as Christians. If persecution comes, then that's God's will, and I'm going to accept it and see it for the opportunity that it is. Maybe it'll be like Habakkuk, that we're praying, God, how long are you going to allow this to continue and all this idolatry and ungodliness? And he says, well, I'm bringing the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, to take care of it. And he's like, whoa, wait a second. That's not what I had in mind, right? And maybe God has in mind something far different to deal with these things so that the church might grow. And the Jews, after Babylonian captivity, they had their issues, but it was not with idolatry. It took care of that problem. But my prayer ultimately is that we might be able to live a quiet and peaceable life. And I've spent half of my adult life under Republican presidents, and I've spent half of my adult life under a Democratic president. And I was able to lead a quiet and peaceable life under either one. But we're also praying because God desires for all men to be saved, for opportunities to preach the gospel, and that those in authority might be influenced by the gospel. So that's my sermon for Sunday. You guys got to hear it first, but that's what we're commanded to pray for. That's our responsibility. And anything beyond that, we're exercising our rights to pray for other things.
And the sermons for the Timberland Drive Church of Christ are going to be posted on their website, and they will be aired by the time this podcast hits. So check that out by all means. And while we're plugging things, Ty has a great lawflog.com is a great resource for the work that he's doing as well. When Reagan mentioned 1 Timothy 2 verse 2 and praying for Nero, who winds up being the emperor that kills Paul, by the way, that creates another discussion. And I preached a sermon a couple of weeks ago, why prayer doesn't work. We get obsessed with short-term results. We want the thorn taken out of our side. And if the thorn is not taken out of our side, that means somehow we did it wrong, or maybe even that God did it wrong. Maybe God's not there at all. Maybe he doesn't care about me or whatever. And prayer is not about changing the world. Prayer is about changing me. Prayer is about turning me into a person who trusts in God in these situations and has enough faith to know that God has a plan for me and God has a destiny for me, and he is going to get me there one way or the other, as long as I'm participating in this plan. And it may not be the road that I expected or the road that I chose. In fact, it's almost certainly not going to be the road that I chose. But that doesn't mean God isn't there, and it doesn't mean that I don't pray. I continue to pray and lean on God in these difficult times, including, like both of you were mentioning, praying for our enemies, praying for the powers that be, that God give them strength to do the right thing and to stand for godliness and righteousness, which they may or may not do. But we have confidence that God ultimately is in control of these things. and this war that we're seeing. We don't know how it's going to turn out, which is really the problem, right? If we knew how it was going to turn out, then we would have some kind of peace. But we don't know. God knows. And God will be glorified at the end of this conflict, ultimately. And that's what we have to put our faith in. Not that it's going to turn out okay, that we'll have the rights that we've gotten used to, that we'll still have this fluffy pillow in our earthly prison cell, but rather that we draw closer to God in our times of difficulty, and we increase our hope that one day we're not going to have to deal with these kind of things anymore.
Well, and I'll pray big on those things. I'll pray that Joe Biden or Donald Trump, they become a Christian. I mean, how would the world change if that were the case, you know? And maybe on a level closer to home, what if our local officials, or most of them, were Christians? What if the teachers and administrators at my kid's school were Christians? What if our bosses were Christians? You know, pray for all those in authority that they might be influenced by the gospel too, to one degree or another. And of course, you know, we have historical precedents of that happening, perhaps no greater one for one in authority who was against Christianity that became a Christian than Paul himself. And can you imagine Christians praying that Saul of Tarsus might become a Christian, right? I mean, how ludicrous is that? And yet he becomes the greatest evangelist, perhaps, in the history of the church.
That's what Ananias says right there in the moment. Go preach to this fellow Saul of Tarsus. Well, you know, God, let's talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah,
I'm not so sure that's such a great idea. You know, that may not turn out so well for me in the short term. Well, God knows what he's doing, and it will work out in his way.
This is what I've been playing.
I've been playing Council of Verona, probably our only political game. I've mentioned it on the podcast before. It pits the Capulets against the Montagues in a Romeo and Juliet themed struggle for power that can get pretty ugly at times. And as with Prince Aeschylus in the play Romeo and Juliet, many a political observer in recent years has been moved to shout a pox on both your houses. And the cause in the play is the same as in today's America, an absolute and unqualified desire to win. And I love winning, make no mistake. If winning the game means poisoning Lady Capulet or pulling strings to make sure Romeo doesn't wind up with Juliet, that's fine with me. But politics, despite what you may have heard, is not a game. Is getting the right candidate elected or the right law passed or the right judge appointed really worth all of this?
In an eternal sense, it doesn't matter at all. I mean, does it matter? Certainly not 2,000 years ago, what Julius Caesar or Nero or any of those people did. I mean, it's at most something in a history book that most people don't even read. 100 years ago, it's the same thing. And even 20 years ago or 10 years ago, it's just not that important. So it becomes a question of how are you spending your resources if your resource is time and you're devoting so much time and so much energy. I don't want to be a hypocrite about this because my job intersects with some of this stuff. So I do spend a lot of time, perhaps too much. But I think you have to start with the understanding in the overall scheme of things, it really isn't that important.
Well, Solomon would say it's vanity and striving after the wind,
right,
because it's life under the sun. You know, like
right,
these things, they come and go and you're not remembered after, and eventually all these things are going to be burned up. Well, I think anytime that we conflate those things of a carnal nature with the gospel, it's not going to be worth it, right? I have a friend who's a faithful Christian who is, I went back and counted, he's posted over 100 times about COVID-19. You know, and he's got great opinions. That's awesome. But, you know, is that really something that's worth it in terms of the influence that he's giving up in other ways because he's pressing his opinion so much on this? I don't think it is.
There's our guest star right there, Ethan. How you doing, buddy?
he's got lots to say. We just won't understand what it is.
Oh,
Well, there are a lot of Christians who I could say the same thing about them. You know, they have an awful lot to say. They don't necessarily know how to phrase it either. I guess what I had in mind when I posed the question in the first place, I'm sorry if it didn't come across as clear as intended. Now you know what it's like to sit in my Bible classes. But there is a climate in our society today that is obsessed with getting what they want in the short term. There was a time in the 1820s to 1840s or so when the Democrats basically ran the country. It was pretty close to a one-party rule. And there was another time in the late 1860s to the early 1880s where it was basically the Republicans. that ran everything. The rest of the time, it's been just understood that sometimes things are going to go your way and sometimes they won't. You're going to win some, you're going to lose some. And you lose this one, well, maybe we'll have to wait 4 years or 2 years or whatever and get it right the next time. And we are in a climate today, I think, where people have said, I have had enough of that. I'm not taking half a loaf anymore. I'm winning every fight from here on in. Me and my people, we're going to do whatever we have to do to win. And they usually couch it in some kind of moral code or sometimes in a spiritual code also. Winning by hook or by crook, the lesser of two evils. We see lots of these phrases popping up to rationalize what would ordinarily and even historically have been categorized as awful, ungodly behavior. And it seems like this world is just getting more and more like that. We've lost the ability to lose graciously, especially as I think you were both talking about, in a circumstance that ultimately, eternally, is of little or no consequence. As I teach my children how to play games, it's far more important that you know how to lose with grace than you know how to win consistently. And what we say in our downtimes, I think, is a lot more important about what we crow from the top of the mountain after having won and gotten exactly what we want.
Well, I think, and I don't want to be overly simplistic, but I think it just all boils down to worldliness. If your treasure is in this world, and your loaf or half a loaf or whatever is in this world, and you're going to fight over that tooth and nail because that's what's important to you. If you see Christians who are jeopardizing spiritual relationships over politics, then, and I've had questions myself about this. Where's your treasure? Is it in this world or is it above? I think there's even a lesson here from the Tower of Babel. I think one of the underappreciated themes of that reference in the Bible is utopianism. We're going to build our heaven here on earth. I think you can also draw, and I'm not going to go off on this tangent, but I think you can also draw some lessons about collectivism. This utopian idea that man is going to come together and he is going to build this society and it's going to solve everything. And pretty much all political parties, maybe with the exception of the libertarians, that to an extent there's that belief, well, if we can just get in charge and tell everybody what to do, then we're going to build that tower to heaven and everything's going to be wonderful.
Both candidates in this presidential election have made the statement that this is the most important election in the history of our country. I just don't think that's true. But even if it were, well, our country's been around not very long. And the world was around a long time before it. And if the Lord doesn't come again, it's going to continue on after America ends. And so there's a sense in which it is all vanity, as Ty said.
Well, and I think the part of the problem being Americans, and I say this in a very broad sense, is that we've got the idea that what happened over the last 200 years was normal.
Yes.
And in the overall history of humankind, it is an extraordinary aberration. And so when we see these things happening, like riots in the streets, people being killed over politics, I mean, we're just aghast, as if this has never happened before. Well, maybe it's not happened quite like this in this country, but it's not anything new under the sun. Sin has its consequences. We have become a fat and happy, wealthy nation, just like Israel did at times. And, we're going to keep following the same cycle they did, if we survive at all.
I call it the danger of the 95%. When you are a starving child in Africa, we've seen videos of kids playing. They somehow find a soccer ball, and there is 10 or 12 of them out there just kicking this ball around. They're having a ball. They don't have any shoes. Half of them don't have any shirt. Clearly, they are malnourished, and they're happy. This is their life, and they are content with that. They don't know any different. And I suspect that their parents are much the same way. It's not a matter of, I wish my life were different. They're living their lives where they are. And I'm not wishing that they don't change by any means, don't get me wrong, but they found contentment there with what we would consider maybe 20%, 25% of what basic human dignity demands, quote unquote demands. And here we are in America, and we have 95%. And we're like the little kid who has gotten exactly what he wanted. He's gotten, the $1,000 Christmas present, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, 4 years in a row or whatever. And all of a sudden he gets an $800 Christmas present instead, and he thinks his world is over. It's a complete and total disaster. He's so used to getting what he expects that he's incapable of handling anything less than perfection. This utopianism that Ty was talking about. We've convinced ourselves we're 95% of the way there, and we are obsessed with the 5%. We have to get this fixed. If we just get this guy elected, we get this law passed, we get such and such practice abolished or whatever, we can get there. And God tells us over and over again, you can't get there. It will never come. It was never his plan for us to have heaven on earth. And the more we pursue it, the more frustrated we get. And the more, whether we realize it or not, I think, the more hope we are placing in this life.
Well, we started this podcast and I said the solution to the problem is the gospel. And that's the case. That was the solution to the problem with the Tower of Babel, right? In Acts 2, we see the unfolding of all of those things that God placed upon them because they didn't follow his will and were looking for some utopia. They heard their languages, the crowd was confused, but they're able to hear the gospel and proclaim the mighty works of God. And ultimately, those souls were saved on the day of Pentecost. The gospel is the solution to all of these, utopian ideas that always fall apart. Well, there is a solution. There is ultimately perfection to be had, but it's not on this earth. It's in submitting to God and having a hope for something better to come.
I think we would do well to lose a few battles in the short term and learn some humility, learn some patience, learn to hope in God and his plan, his long-term plan for our life, rather than getting exactly what we want, exactly when we want it.
There is some uniqueness at this point in our history in going back to the original topic of politics and elections and how that intersects with Christianity, in that the parties have diverged more and more. And where it used to be that the candidates were really not that far apart, now they are sometimes drastically far apart on issues. So that much has changed. But going back to the point you guys were making, we can't change with that. We have to understand as they split, there's still that one objective standard that we follow, and maybe one candidate is or isn't better for us. But, if Paul could pray for Nero and live under Nero, then certainly, we can live under this presidential candidate if he wins the election. I've had to do that. There were certain candidates that I thought would just be awful, and we survived 8 years and we're still here, so, and that's not a guarantee that we will survive the next guy, but ultimately that's not where our time and energy should be directed in worrying about who's going to be in charge.
Thank you for listening to the Citizen of Heaven podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe if you have not already. Shares, ratings, comments, and questions are always welcome. Feel free to reach out to me on social media with any questions or suggestions, and watch my YouTube channel and our website, www.halhammons.com, for articles, sermons, and notifications regarding other content. Until next time, be strong and courageous, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammons, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.